In the arid highlands of southeastern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border, there is a hill that does not look like much. It rises gently from the plain, a rounded mound of dust and limestone, baked by the sun and scoured by wind. For centuries, local farmers walked past it, plowed around it, and knew it only as Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. They assumed it was a medieval graveyard or a Byzantine ruin. Nothing about it seemed ancient, nothing about it seemed extraordinary. But beneath that ordinary surface, buried by thousands of years of silence, lay something that would force historians to rewrite the early chapters of human civilization. The first clue came in the 1960s when a survey team from the University of Chicago visited the area. They recorded the mound, noted some broken limestone slabs, and moved on. The site was cataloged but not excavated. It remained a footnote for 3 decades. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt drove out to the hill on a hunch. He had been studying prehistoric sites in the region and had seen the survey notes. He wanted to look for himself. What he found on the surface stopped him cold. Scattered among the weeds and rubble were dozens of flint chips, the debris of stone tool making, and a large rectangular slab of limestone that had clearly been shaped by human hand. As it was not a grave marker, it was something older, something heavier. Schmidt knew he had found a site that could change everything. The excavation that followed revealed a world that no one had imagined. Beneath the topsoil, the earth gave up massive T-shaped limestone pillars, each one carved from the bedrock, each one weighing between 10 and 20 tons. They stood in circles, arranged like standing stones at Stonehenge, but far older. And they were not blank. The surfaces of these pillars were covered in relief carvings. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boars, cranes, and vultures. The animals moved across the stone with a precision that spoke of skilled hands and long tradition. The circles themselves were not simple. They contained 2 central pillars, often larger than the rest, surrounded by a ring of smaller pillars. The entire enclosure was set into the earth, built deliberately to be entered, to be seen, to be used for something. The question was when. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the backfill around the pillars gave an answer that made archaeologists pause. The oldest levels at Göbekli Tepe date to roughly 9600 BCE. That is 11,600 years before the present day. That is 6,000 years before the invention of writing. That is 7,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is a time when, according to the standard narrative, human beings were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands, following herds and gathering wild plants. They were not supposed to be building monumental stone architecture. The old story went like this. First, humans learned to farm. They domesticated wheat and barley, then goats and sheep. With a stable food supply, they could settle in one place. Villages grew, populations expanded, social hierarchies emerged. And only then, once people had surplus food and organized labor, did they build temples. The temple came after the city. That was the sequence. That was the logic. Göbekli Tepe turned that logic on its head. The people who built this site had no domesticated crops. They had no permanent villages. They lived in small, mobile groups hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. Yet they managed to quarry, shape, transport, and erect pillars that weighed as much as a school bus. They did it without metal tools, without draft animals, without wheels. They did it with flint, with rope, with human muscle, and with something else. Coordination on a scale that seemed impossible for their time. The site itself offers clues about how they did it. The limestone bedrock beneath the hill was the quarry. The builders cut the pillars directly from the rock, using flint picks to carve channels around each block. They then levered the pillar free, dragged it up the slope, and set it into a socket carved into the bedrock. The circles were built in phases, one generation adding to the work of the last. And then, after centuries of use, the enclosures were deliberately backfilled with rubble and debris, sealing them for thousands of years. That backfill preserved the site. It also contained the bones of wild animals, the broken tools of the builders, and the remains of feasts. Someone brought food to this hill. Someone gathered here in numbers that should not have been possible. The mainstream archaeological response has been careful. There is no need to invoke aliens, lost continents, or superhuman civilizations. The mystery is already strong enough inside the discipline. What Göbekli Tepe shows is that hunter-gatherers were capable of complex social organization when the motivation was strong enough. The motivation appears to have been ritual. The T-shaped pillars are often interpreted as stylized human figures. The central pair in each enclosure may represent ancestors, deities, or mythic beings. The animals carved on them are not random. They are predators and dangerous creatures chosen for symbolic power. This was not a village. This was a sanctuary, a place where people came for ceremonies, for gatherings, for something that mattered enough to move stone across a hillside. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In recent years, surveys and excavations in the same region have revealed a wider network of sites known collectively as Tas Tepeler, Stone Hills. Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers to the east, contains similar T-shaped pillars, similar animal carvings, and similar circular enclosures. It too dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic, the same period as Göbekli Tepe. The pattern suggests a cultural complex spread across the landscape, a shared tradition of ritual architecture that predates settled life. These were not isolated experiments. They were part of a world. The deeper question that emerges from all this is not about technology or chronology. It is about what holds human societies together. The standard explanation has always been material: food surplus, trade, defense. But Göbekli Tepe suggests another possibility. Maybe it was belief, maybe it was ritual, maybe it was a shared story, a myth, a vision of the world that made people willing to cooperate on a scale they had never attempted before. The temple may have been the engine that pulled people into larger communities, not the product of communities that had already formed. The feast, the ceremony, the pilgrimage, these may have been the first steps toward the city. If that is true, then the foundations of civilization are not economic. They are spiritual. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is not a minor detail. It is one of the most provocative acts in the entire story. When the enclosures were backfilled, it was not done carelessly. The material was brought in deliberately, layer by layer, sealing the pillars and carvings with the same intentionality that went into their construction. Archaeologists can infer that this was a planned closure, possibly a ritual decommissioning, but what they cannot infer is why. Was it to preserve the sacred space to mark the end of an era, to hide it from enemies, or was it simply the final act of a belief system that had run its course? The backfill preserve at the site, but it also erased the context of its abandonment, leaving only the silence of buried stone. The animal carvings on the pillars deepen the mystery. They are not random decorations. Foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and boars appear repeatedly, each carved with precision and symbolic intent. But the arrangement of these carvings across the pillars creates a problem that goes beyond engineering. The symbols seem to tell a story, but we lack the key to read it. Are they mythic narratives, maps of the sky, clan totems? The pillars themselves are arranged in circles, with the tallest at the center, suggesting a hierarchy of meaning. This is not a simple building problem. It is a symbolic system. The builders were not just moving stone. They were encoding a worldview into the landscape. And that worldview, whatever it was, required immense coordination to manifest. The question is not how they lifted the pillars, but why they felt compelled to do so in such a specific, symbolic way. Karahan Tepe, excavated more recently, widens the context without stealing the main story. Located about 35 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, it contains similar T-shaped pillars, animal carvings, and circular enclosures. But Karahan Tepe also reveals something new. Evidence of domestic structures, perhaps the earliest permanent houses in the region built alongside the ritual enclosures. This complicates the narrative. It suggests that ritual and settlement were intertwined from the start, not separate phases. The Tas Tepeler complex, a network of at least a dozen sites, points to a shared cultural horizon across southeastern Anatolia. These people were not isolated bands. They were part of a widespread tradition of monumental construction long before agriculture took hold. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly. It is the tip of an iceberg. The skeptical boundary must be drawn clearly here. There is no evidence for aliens, lost supercivilizations, or mystical powers. The builders were fully human, with the same cognitive abilities we have. What they lacked was the accumulated knowledge of later millennia. They figured out how to quarry, transport, and erect massive stones using only stone tools, rope, and human labor. That is impressive, but not supernatural. What is genuinely revisionist is the implication that hunter-gatherers could organize labor on this scale without a centralized authority or economic surplus. The The old model said that settled life came first, then complex society. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse. Shared ritual may have created the social pressure that made settled life possible. This is not a claim about lost technology. It is a claim about the power of belief to reorganize human behavior. And that brings us back to the central question. Did shared ritual help create the social pressure that made settled life possible? The evidence from Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and the wider Tas-Tepeler complex points toward an A answer. The effort to build these sanctuaries required cooperation across multiple groups, likely drawn together by seasonal gatherings, feasts, and ceremonies. The remains of wild animal bones and grinding tools suggest that people brought food to the site, perhaps as offerings, perhaps for communal meals. Over time, the need to support these gatherings may have encouraged the cultivation of wild grains and the domestication of animals. The temple did not simply precede the city. It may have been the engine that drove the transition toward it. The stones on the hill are not just monuments to the past, they are the foundation of the world we live in now. Not all archaeologists agree with this interpretation. Some argue that Göbekli Tepe may have been built by people who already had a form of proto-agriculture, that the line between hunter-gatherer and farmer is blurrier than we think. Others point out that we have only excavated a small fraction of the site, and that the full story may be more complex. These are fair cautions. Science moves slowly, and the evidence is still being uncovered. But the basic fact remains. A monumental ritual complex was built at the end of the last ice age by people who lived without farms, without villages, without kings. That fact does not fit the old story. It demands a new one. Göbekli Tepe sits on that hill still, partially excavated, partially buried, waiting for the next generation of archaeologists to dig deeper. The pillars stand in the open air now, protected by a roof that keeps the rain off the carvings. Visitors walk between the circles and see the foxes and vultures that were carved 12,000 years ago. The wind blows across the plain just as it did when the hunters came here to raise their stones. They did not build for permanence, they built for something else. And we are still trying to understand what that something was. The temple broke history. It also broke our assumptions about who we are and how we came to be here. That is the real weight of the stones.